The Galactic Council's Grand Assembly Hall buzzed with the chittering, growling, and harmonious voices of 1,000 different species. Representatives from across known space had gathered for the most important meeting in galactic history. War was coming. The Void Hunters, an ancient race of mechanical beings, had awakened from their million-year slumber and were systematically destroying entire star systems. Ambassador Zextai of the Reptilian Dominion slammed his scaled fist against the podium, his yellow eyes blazing with frustration. We need warriors. Battle-tested soldiers who can face the Void Hunters and live to tell about it. A chorus of agreement rose from the assembled delegates. The insectoid hive queen clicked her mandibles approvingly. The crystalline beings of Nexus Prime chimed in harmony. Even the usually peaceful tree folk of Verdania swayed their massive forms in agreement. What about the humans? Squeaked Piptau, the small furry representative from the rodent-like Squeaker Federation. They're part of the council now. A wave of laughter rippled through the assembly. Ambassador Zextai's forked tongue flicked out in amusement. The humans? Those soft, pink creatures who've barely mastered faster-than-light travel? They've been part of our council for exactly one standard cycle. What could they possibly offer? In the back corner of the hall, almost invisible among the towering alien forms, sat the human delegation. 3 figures in simple gray uniforms, unremarkable and easily overlooked. The other species had long since stopped paying attention to them, dismissing humanity as the galactic equivalent of a minor footnote. Marcus Chun, the human ambassador, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Beside him, Admiral Sarah Foster maintained her composed military bearing, though her jaw tightened at the mockery. The third human, however, remained perfectly still. He hadn't spoken a single word during the entire 3-day conference. The nameplate before him read simply, Advisor, Classification Restricted. The being everyone called the Silent Human appeared ordinary by human standards. Average height, lean build, dark hair with touches of silver at the temples. His pale blue eyes seemed to absorb everything while revealing nothing. He wore the same gray uniform as his companions, but somehow it looked different on him, like a disguise rather than proper attire. Perhaps, Ambassador Chen said, rising slowly to address the assembly, humanity could contribute in ways that might surprise you. Another wave of laughter, this time more derisive. A massive bear-like creature from the Ursine Confederacy stood up, its voice booming across the hall. No offense, human, but your species has fought exactly 0 galactic conflicts. Your largest military engagement was against yourselves. We need proven warriors, not diplomats playing at war. The silent human's expression didn't change, but Admiral Foster noticed his fingers drum once against the table. She'd served with him long enough to recognize that tiny tell. Someone was about to make a very serious mistake. The Void Hunters have already consumed 17 star systems, continued the Ursine representative. Billions upon billions of lives lost. They don't negotiate, they don't retreat, and they don't show mercy. This isn't some border skirmish where humans can send a few patrol ships and call it victory. General Krothmos of the militant Saurian Empire stood next, his scarred hide telling the story of countless battles. The humans fought amongst themselves for millennia, yes, but always with primitive weapons. Projectile firearms, explosive devices, crude chemical weapons. The Void Hunters possess technology that makes our most advanced weapons look like children's toys. They adapt, added the ethereal voice of a phantom delegate, its translucent form shimmering. Every strategy we've attempted, every weapon we've deployed, they analyze and counter within hours. We need forces capable of thinking beyond conventional warfare. Which brings us back to proven military might, rumbled the Ursine representative. The Reptilian Dominion has been fighting wars for 10,000 years. The Saurian Empire has never known peace. Even the hive mind has conquered 3 galaxies. What have humans conquered besides their own homeworld? The silent human finally moved. Not much, just a slight tilt of his head, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. Admiral Foster had seen that look before, usually right before everything went sideways in ways no one could predict. Ambassador Chun tried again, his voice carrying a note of desperation. I understand your concerns, but humanity has faced extinction-level threats before. We've survived ice ages, plagues, asteroid impacts, and our own weapons of mass destruction. We're remarkably good at finding ways to survive when everything seems hopeless. Survival is not victory, snapped the Hive Queen, her compound eyes glittering with disdain. The Void Hunters don't seek to rule or conquer. They exist only to consume and destroy. There's nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. This requires the kind of warfare your species has never experienced. High Counselor Vexmari, an ancient being whose species had helped found the Galactic Council eons ago, spoke with the weight of millennia in his voice. Young humans, your species shows promise. In perhaps 10,000 years, when you've developed proper military traditions and faced real galactic threats, you might have something valuable to contribute. For now, leave this to your betters. The condescension in his tone made even Admiral Foster's diplomatic training falter. Her hand clenched into a fist beneath the table. But the silent human remained motionless, those pale blue eyes continuing their patient observation of the assembled aliens. Besides, added a delegate from the aquatic depth dwellers, what sort of military advisor doesn't even speak? How can he contribute strategy if he won't participate in discussions? More laughter, though some of the newer council species seemed uncomfortable with the open mockery. The plant-based chlorophyll coalition rustled their leaves in what might have been disapproval, and a few of the smaller mammalian species exchanged worried glances. Perhaps he's mute, suggested someone from the back. Or maybe he doesn't understand galactic standard language? No, said Ambassador Chen quietly, and something in his tone made several nearby delegates look up with interest. He understands perfectly. He just doesn't waste words. Waste words. The Ursine representative's massive frame shook with amusement. In military planning, communication is everything. How can a silent warrior lead troops or coordinate strategies? He doesn't lead troops, Admiral Foster said, speaking for the first time in hours. Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone who'd commanded star fleets in actual combat. He doesn't need to coordinate strategies. That's not what he does. Then, what exactly does he do? Demanded General Crothmos, his reptilian eyes narrowing with suspicion. For a moment, the hall fell silent. Even the background hum of translation devices seemed to fade. All eyes turned to the human delegation, waiting for an answer. The silent human moved again, this time turning his head slightly to look directly at General Crothmos. Those pale blue eyes met the Saurian's fierce gaze without flinching, without fear, without any emotion at all. It was the look of someone examining an interesting insect, noting its characteristics before moving on to more important matters. General Crothmos, veteran of 1,000 battles and conqueror of countless worlds, felt an unexpected chill run down his spine. There was something in that gaze, something that spoke of depths better left unexplored. He ends things, Admiral Foster said simply. When everything else has failed, when conventional warfare isn't enough, when the situation becomes impossible by every metric known to military science, he ends things. The Hive Queen's mandibles clicked with irritation. Cryptic nonsense. We need concrete capabilities, not mysterious wordplay. You want concrete capabilities? Ambassador Chen stood up fully, his human features hardening into something that looked almost alien in its intensity. Advisor, would you mind showing them your service record? The silent human reached into his jacket and withdrew a small data pad. He set it on the table and activated it with a single touch. A holographic display materialized above the device, showing a dense wall of text in the standardized galactic military format. The nearest delegate, a scholarly being from the Archive Collective, leaned forward to read and immediately recoiled as if struck. His synthetic voice box crackled with disbelief. This cannot be accurate. What does it say? Demanded the Ursine representative. The archive scholar's optical sensors whirred as they focused and refocused on the display. According to this record, this single human has been personally responsible for ending 47 separate military conflicts. Not participating in their conclusion, not contributing to their resolution, but single-handedly bringing them to an end. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the assembly. Several delegates activated their own translation systems, certain they'd misheard. Impossible, stated General Crothmos flatly. No single being could accomplish such a thing, regardless of species. The archive scholar continued reading, his voice growing more strained with each line. 18 civil wars terminated within 72 hours of his arrival. 12 colonial rebellions ended without a single shot being fired after he spoke to the leadership. 7 interplanetary conflicts resolved through what the records describe as direct intervention of a classified nature. What kind of classified intervention? The Hive Queen's compound eyes glittered with sudden interest. The scholar's optical array dimmed. The details are restricted at a level above my clearance. But there are annotations here, cross-references to incidents that. He paused, processing information at superhuman speeds. By the ancient codes, some of these events are legends. The silencing of Kareth Prime. The 3-hour war of the Epsilon Sector. The great vanishing of the Iron Fong fleet. A new silence fell over the assembly, this one heavy with recognition. Every species present had heard those stories, passed down through their respective military traditions. Events so decisive, so final, that they'd become cautionary tales told to young warriors. High Counselor Vexmari spoke slowly, his ancient voice carrying a note of uncertainty for the first time in centuries. Those events occurred before humanity achieved interstellar flight, before your species was even aware that galactic civilization existed. Ambassador Chen nodded grimly. That's correct. He's been working off-world for considerably longer than most people realize. Working for whom? The question came from a dozen throats simultaneously. That information is classified at the highest levels, Admiral Foster replied. What I can tell you is that when the Galactic Council has faced threats too dangerous for conventional military response, when entire civilizations have hung in the balance and every other option has been exhausted, they've called for the Reaper. The name hit the assembly like a physical blow. Several delegates actually stumbled backward, their universal translators struggling with the implications of that single word. The Reaper wasn't just a legend or a bedtime story to frighten children. The Reaper was the galaxy's most carefully guarded secret, a final solution reserved for threats that couldn't be handled through normal channels. You're claiming this unremarkable human is the Reaper? The Ursine representative's voice had lost all its earlier bravado. That's impossible. The Reaper is a myth, a story told by defeated enemies to explain the inexplicable. The Reaper is whatever needs to be, Admiral Foster said quietly. Sometimes a diplomat who ends wars with words. Sometimes a strategist who sees solutions others miss. Sometimes a warrior who fights battles in ways that ensure they never need to be fought again. The form changes depending on what the situation requires. But always effective, added Ambassador Chun. Always final. And always forgotten by anyone who might threaten galactic stability with the knowledge. The silent human had been watching this exchange with the same detached interest he'd shown throughout the conference. Now he reached forward and deactivated the data pad, making the holographic display disappear. The simple gesture somehow carried more weight than all the dramatic speeches and military posturing of the past 3 days. General Crothmos found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. If you are truly the Reaper, then why haven't you acted against the Void Hunters already? For the first time since the conference began, the silent human spoke. His voice was unremarkable, neither deep nor high, neither commanding nor weak. It was the voice of someone who'd never needed to shout to be heard, never needed to threaten to be feared, because they haven't finished revealing themselves yet. The simple statement sent a chill through the assembly that had nothing to do with the hall's environmental controls. Every delegate present had access to the same intelligence reports, the same sensor data, the same tactical analyses. The Void Hunters had already demonstrated capabilities beyond anything in recorded galactic history. They'd consumed entire star systems, leaving nothing behind but empty space and quantum echoes. If that wasn't their full potential, what do you mean? High Counselor Vexmari asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. The Reaper's pale blue eyes swept across the assembly, taking in the fear and uncertainty that was beginning to replace the earlier mockery and dismissal. Their testing responses, measuring capabilities, learning what this galaxy can do before they commit their real forces. Real forces? The Hive Queen's voice rose to a pitch that made several species wince. They've already deployed planet killers, reality disruptors, and temporal weapons. What could be worse than what we've already seen? Everything, the Reaper replied simply. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. No clarification, no elaboration, no comfort. Just that single, terrifying certainty. Ambassador Zextai, who'd begun this session by mocking humanity's potential contribution, now found himself hoping desperately that the silent human had some kind of plan. How? How long do we have before these real forces arrive? The Reaper stood up slowly, his movements precise and economical. Every eye in the assembly tracked him as he straightened his unremarkable gray uniform and picked up his datapad. "They'll know I'm here soon," he said, his voice still calm and conversational. "When they do, they'll accelerate their timeline. I estimate 72 hours before they begin their actual offensive. And then?" The Reaper looked directly at Ambassador Zextai, and the reptilian diplomat saw something in those pale blue eyes that made him wish he'd never asked the question. It wasn't cruelty or anger or any emotion he could identify. It was simply the absolute certainty of someone who'd seen the end of the story and knew exactly how it would play out. "And then, I do what I do," the Reaper said quietly. He turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps making no sound on the assembly hall's polished floor. Admiral Foster and Ambassador Chun rose to follow, but he gestured for them to remain seated. "The council session should continue," he said without turning around. "Make your plans. Deploy your fleets. Coordinate your strategies. Do everything you would normally do when facing an existential threat." "But will it matter?" called out Piptau, the small squeaker representative who'd first mentioned humanity. "If you're going to do what you do, why do we need conventional forces at all?" The Reaper paused at the exit, his hand resting on the control panel. For a moment, his perfectly controlled expression seemed to soften slightly, though it might have been a trick of the lighting. "Because," he said quietly, "someone needs to survive to remember what happened here. Someone needs to carry the story forward, to make sure the galaxy learns the right lessons from what's about to occur." "What lessons?" High Counselor Vexmari's ancient voice trembled with something that might have been hope or terror. The Reaper activated the exit control, and the massive doors began to slide open with a deep, resonant hum. "That some problems require simple solutions," he said without looking back. "And that the most dangerous beings in the galaxy are often the ones who seem the most ordinary." He stepped through the doorway and disappeared into the corridor beyond, leaving behind an assembly of the galaxy's most powerful beings sitting in stunned silence. For several minutes, no one spoke. The weight of what they'd just learned, what they'd just witnessed, pressed down on them like a physical force. Finally, Ambassador Zextai found his voice. "Admiral Foster," he said, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by something approaching reverence. "Is there anything else we should know about your advisor?" Admiral Foster looked around the assembly, taking in the fear, the uncertainty, and the desperate hope in 1,000 alien faces. She thought about classification levels and security protocols, about secrets that had been kept for millennia and knowledge that could reshape galactic civilization. Then, she thought about the next 72 hours and what was coming. "Just one thing," she said finally. "When this is over, when the Void Hunters are gone and the galaxy is safe again, most of you will forget he was ever here. Your memories will be adjusted, your records will be sealed, and life will go on as if none of this ever happened." "Why?" "Because that's how it always works," Ambassador Chen answered quietly. "The Reaper solves the problem, saves the galaxy, and then becomes a story that's too dangerous to remember, too powerful to acknowledge, too final to accept." High Counselor Vexmari's ancient eyes reflected the wisdom of eons and the weight of terrible knowledge. "How many times has this happened before?" Admiral Foster and Ambassador Chun exchanged a look that spoke of shared secrets and classified truths. "Enough times that the galaxy still exists," Admiral Foster said simply. Outside the assembly hall, in corridors that had seen the rise and fall of 1,000 civilizations, the being known as the Reaper walked alone toward whatever came next. His footsteps made no sound, his passage left no trace, and his expression revealed nothing of the thoughts that moved behind those pale blue eyes. In 72 hours, the Void Hunters would learn what it meant to threaten a galaxy under his protection. In 72 hours, they would understand why some beings were called legends even by those who'd forgotten they were real. In 72 hours, they would face the Reaper. And, like every threat before them, They would discover too late that the most terrible power in the galaxy belonged to the silent human who seemed so perfectly ordinary. The first sign wasn't an explosion or an invasion fleet breaking through hyperspace. It was silence. Admiral Foster stood on the bridge of the human flagship Determination, watching the holographic display that showed the galaxy's primary communication network. One by one, the bright nodes representing inhabited star systems were going dark. Not destroyed, not conquered, simply absent, as if they had never existed at all. Status report, she called to her tactical officer. Lieutenant Commander Park's voice carried the strain of someone who'd been on duty for 36 straight hours. 17 more systems went offline in the past hour, Admiral. That brings the total to 41 confirmed losses since the Void Hunters began their real offensive. 41 star systems. Billions of beings simply erased from existence, leaving behind nothing but empty space and the faint quantum echoes that served as the galaxy's only proof they'd ever been real. The assembled fleets of the Galactic Council had been powerless to stop it. Their most advanced weapons simply ceased to function when they encountered Void Hunter technology. Their fastest ships couldn't catch enemies that moved through dimensions that didn't technically exist. Any word from the Reaper? Admiral Foster asked quietly. Commander Park shook his head. He's been radio silent since he left the council chambers 3 days ago. His personal transport disappeared from all tracking systems approximately 6 hours after departure. Admiral Foster nodded, trying to project the kind of calm confidence that kept crews functional during impossible situations. Inside, she was fighting the same creeping terror that was affecting every sentient being in the galaxy. She'd worked with the Reaper for 15 years, had seen him end conflicts that defied every rule of warfare and strategy. But this was different. The Void Hunters weren't just another enemy to be defeated. They were erasure itself, the physical manifestation of the concept that some things simply shouldn't exist. Admiral, called the communications officer, we're receiving a priority transmission from the Saurian Empire flagship. General Krothmos is requesting an immediate conference call with all fleet commanders. Put him through. The main screen flickered, then split into a dozen different views showing the commanders of the various species' military forces. General Krothmos looked like he'd aged decades in the past few days. His scarred hide had taken on a grayish tinge, and his usual aggressive confidence had been replaced by something approaching desperation. Fellow commanders, he began without preamble, we need to discuss our current tactical situation. You mean our complete inability to fight back? The voice belonged to Admiral Zawayek's era of the Crystalline Defense Force, whose ship bodies glowed with an angry red light. My vessels can't even get within sensor range of the Void Hunters before their molecular structure begins to dissolve. Queen Hive Mother Kelthara's compound eyes glittered with fury as she spoke through her communication array. My drones have attempted 17 different attack patterns. The Void Hunters don't just destroy them, they retroactively prevent them from ever having existed. I'm losing soldiers to temporal erasure. The Ursine commander, Fleet Admiral Gormash, slammed his massive paw against his command console. This isn't warfare, it's systematic extermination. They're not trying to conquer us or rule us. They're removing us from reality itself. Admiral Foster listened to the growing despair in her colleagues' voices and felt the weight of knowledge she couldn't share. The truth was classified beyond any level these commanders could access, but she'd been briefed on enough historical incidents to know how this would end. The question wasn't whether the galaxy would survive. The question was what price would be paid for that survival. Has anyone been able to establish communication with the Void Hunters? Asked High Admiral Vex Carey, the ancient being's voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd lived through too many wars to count. We tried, replied General Krothmos. Every frequency, every protocol, even psionic contact attempts. They don't respond because they don't need to. Communication requires acknowledging that the other party exists. The Void Hunters appear to consider us an error that needs correcting. An error in what? Admiral Foster found herself asking. Reality, answered a new voice, one that made every commander on the call straighten involuntarily. They consider biological life an error in the fundamental structure of reality. The screen flickered, then reorganized to show a 13th participant. The Reaper sat in what appeared to be the bridge of a ship none of them recognized, though something about the lighting and the subtle geometric patterns visible behind him suggested technology far beyond anything the Galactic Council possessed. "Sir," Admiral Foster said, her military training overriding her relief at seeing him alive. "What's your status?" "Currently infiltrating the Void Hunter command structure," the Reaper replied conversationally, as if he'd just announced plans to grab lunch. "They're more complex than our initial intelligence suggested. Also more limited, which is both good and bad news." General Crothmose leaned forward, his reptilian features intense with concentration. "Explain." "The good news is that they're not native to this reality. They're essentially antibodies from a universe where consciousness never evolved, where matter organizes itself in purely mechanical patterns. They can't truly understand biological life because their universe never produced it." "And the bad news?" Queen Hivemother Kelthara asked, though her tone suggested she already dreaded the answer. "The bad news is that they're not here by choice. Something sent them, something that's systematically cleaning biological life from multiple realities. We're dealing with the advanced scouts of a multiversal sterilization protocol." The implications of that statement hit the assembled commanders like a physical blow. Admiral Zoexera's crystalline form actually cracked audibly. "Multiple realities? How many?" "Classified," the Reaper said simply. "What matters is that stopping them requires a very specific approach. One that will seem counterintuitive to everything you've been taught about military strategy." Fleet Admiral Gormash's massive frame leaned into the screen. "We're listening. You need to do absolutely nothing." Silence fell over the communication channel. The assembled commanders stared at their screens, certain they'd misheard. "Nothing," General Crothmose finally managed. "They're systematically erasing our civilization, and you want us to do nothing?" "I want you to survive," the Reaper corrected quietly. "Every ship you send against them provides data they can use to refine their erasure protocols. Every weapon you fire gives them insight into the technological level of this reality. Every strategy you attempt teaches them how biological minds approach problems." "Then, how do we fight back?" Admiral Foster asked. "You don't." "I do." The simple statement carried absolute finality, but High Admiral Vexgary's ancient wisdom rebelled against accepting it. One being, even the Reaper, cannot stand against forces capable of erasing entire star systems. "You're right," the Reaper agreed. "One being can't. But I'm not approaching this as a being." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to become something they can't erase because it was never fully real to begin with." The cryptic answer would have been frustrating under normal circumstances, but the assembled commanders had learned to trust the Reaper's methods even when they didn't understand them. Still, watching their civilizations disappear while remaining passive went against every military instinct they possessed. "How long do we have?" Admiral Foster asked. The Reaper consulted something off-screen, his expression never changing. "At their current rate of expansion, they'll reach the core worlds in approximately 18 hours. After that, they'll begin systematic erasure of all major population centers." 18 hours, Queen Hivemother Kelthara repeated. "And we're supposed to just wait while billions die?" "You're supposed to evacuate as many beings as possible to designated safe zones and prepare for post-conflict reconstruction," the Reaper replied. "The coordinates are being transmitted to your tactical officers now." New data streams appeared on every ship's communication system, showing locations scattered throughout the galaxy. Admiral Foster's tactical officer studied the information and looked up with confusion. "Sir, these coordinates, most of them are in empty space. No planets, no stations, nothing to provide protection or resources. They will by the time you arrive," the Reaper said. "Trust the process." "And if you fail?" The question came from Admiral Zoexera, her crystalline voice carrying harmonic undertones of deep concern. For the first time since the communication began, the Reaper's expression showed something that might have been emotion. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around his eyes, but it was more human feeling than most of the commanders had ever seen from him. "If I fail," he said quietly, "then biological life in this universe ends in approximately 72 hours. But I won't fail." "How can you be so certain?" General Crothmose demanded. "Because I've done this before." The statement hung in the void between them, carrying implications that none of the military commanders were cleared to understand. Admiral Foster had heard whispers, fragments of classified briefings that suggested the Reaper's activities extended far beyond what any official records indicated. But this was the first time he directly referenced operating in scenarios similar to their current crisis. How many times? She found herself asking. Classified. The other realities the Void Hunters destroyed, High Admiral Vexcary said slowly. Did they have someone like you? No. The single word carried more weight than entire volumes of military philosophy. It suggested that their reality possessed something unique, something that gave them a chance against forces that had successfully sterilized uncounted universes. What makes this reality different? Admiral Foster asked. Humanity. The answer surprised everyone, including Admiral Foster. Sir, every other reality they've cleansed developed along predictable evolutionary paths. Consciousness emerged, civilizations formed, technology advanced according to logical progressions. But humanity introduces chaos into that pattern. Your species doesn't follow the rules that govern how biological life is supposed to develop. Fleet Admiral Gormash rumbled with confusion. The humans are barely a century into galactic civilization. How could they be significant enough to affect universal patterns? Because we're not just biological, the Reaper said, and something in his tone made several commanders involuntarily step back from their screens. We're something else wearing a biological disguise. Something that evolved in the spaces between realities, in the cracks where normal rules don't apply. That's impossible, Queen Hive Mother Kel'Thras stated flatly. We've studied human biology extensively. You're carbon-based life forms, nothing more. Our bodies are carbon-based, the Reaper agreed. What drives those bodies is something else entirely. Something the Void Hunters can't categorize, can't understand, and therefore can't successfully erase. Prove it, General Crothmos challenged. The Reaper's image flickered for a moment, and, when it stabilized, every commander on the call felt a chill that had nothing to do with their ship's environmental systems. He looked exactly the same, but something fundamental had changed. The lighting around him seemed wrong, as if photons themselves were uncertain about how to behave in his presence. I am currently existing in 17 different dimensional phases simultaneously, he said conversationally. My consciousness is distributed across 43 separate probability streams. The being you're speaking with is a quantum echo of something that exists primarily in conceptual space rather than physical reality. The technical officers on every ship began frantically checking their sensor readings, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with known physics. Their instruments provided conflicting data, suggesting that the Reaper existed and didn't exist in equal measure. When the Void Hunters encounter me, he continued, they'll attempt to erase something that was never entirely real to begin with. The logical paradox will cascade through their entire network, forcing them to confront the possibility that their fundamental understanding of reality is incomplete. And that will stop them? Admiral Foster asked. That will confuse them long enough for me to introduce a virus into their collective consciousness. A very specific virus designed to make them question whether biological life is truly an error or whether their own existence might be the actual mistake. The implications of that strategy were staggering. The Reaper wasn't planning to fight the Void Hunters directly. He was going to make them doubt their own purpose, their own reality, their own right to exist. How long will that take? High Admiral Vexcary asked. From your perspective, it will happen instantaneously. From mine, it will require me to exist in approximately 14,000 different temporal states, while simultaneously dying and not dying across multiple probability matrices. That sounds. Admiral Zyxera paused, her crystalline structure flashing with confused harmonics. That sounds like it would destroy you. It will. The simple acknowledgement silenced every voice on the communication channel. The being they'd mocked just days earlier, the unremarkable human who seemed so perfectly ordinary, was calmly explaining how he planned to sacrifice not just his life, but his entire existence to save a galaxy that had barely accepted his species as equals. There has to be another way, Admiral Foster said, her professional composure cracking for the first time since the crisis began. There is, the Reaper agreed. We could evacuate this reality entirely, abandon the universe to the Void Hunters, and find somewhere else for biological life to develop. But that would mean accepting that consciousness is weaker than mechanical order, that creativity and chaos are less fundamental than predictable patterns. And you don't accept that? I don't accept that anything is inevitable. The conviction in his voice was absolute, carrying the weight of someone who'd spent lifetimes proving that impossible situations were simply problems that hadn't been approached from the right angle yet. The evacuation coordinates I'm transmitting will place you beyond the Void Hunter's immediate reach, he continued. Once I've resolved the current situation, you can return and begin rebuilding. The galaxy will need strong leadership to process what's about to happen. Will we remember? General Crothmose asked quietly. Some of you will. Enough to ensure the lessons are preserved. What lessons? Queen Hivemother Kel'Thara demanded. The Reaper's image began to flicker again, suggesting that his attention was being divided across multiple dimensions simultaneously. That evolution isn't a process, it's a choice. That consciousness isn't an accident, it's a rebellion. And that sometimes the most dangerous beings in the galaxy are the ones who refuse to accept that anything is impossible. Sir, Admiral Foster said urgently, sensing that the communication was about to end, is there anything we can do to help? Remember that humanity didn't ask for your acceptance, the Reaper replied. We didn't need your permission to exist, and we didn't require your approval to become something more than biology and chemistry. When this is over, when the galaxy is safe again, remember that the most important choices are made by beings who refuse to be limited by what others think is possible. The screen flickered one final time, and the Reaper's image dissolved into static. The assembled commanders stared at their displays, processing the magnitude of what they'd just witnessed and the implications of what was coming. Well, Fleet Admiral Gormash said finally, his massive voice unusually quiet. I suppose we should begin the evacuation. Admiral Foster, High Admiral Vexcary said, his ancient eyes reflecting the weight of eons. When this is over, assuming we survive, humanity's status in the Galactic Council will need to be reconsidered. Admiral Foster nodded slowly, thinking about classified files and historical incidents, about legends that were too dangerous to remember and beings who existed in the spaces between what was possible and what was necessary. Yes, she said quietly. It will. Across the galaxy, the greatest evacuation in recorded history began as billions of beings fled toward coordinates that promised safety, but offered no guarantees. Behind them, star systems continued to vanish as the Void Hunters pressed their systematic erasure of biological life. And somewhere in the space between realities, in dimensions that existed primarily as mathematical concepts, the being known as the Reaper prepared to become something that had never existed before and would never exist again, something specifically designed to ask the most dangerous question in any universe. What if everything you believe about reality is wrong? In 14 hours, the Void Hunters would have their answer. In 14 hours, they would learn what it meant to encounter something that refused to be erased. In 14 hours, they would face the full implications of humanity's rebellion against the limits of what was supposed to be possible. Reality began to fracture at 1437 Galactic Standard Time. Admiral Foster felt it first as a subtle wrongness in the fabric of space around the evacuation fleet. Stars that had been burning steadily for billions of years flickered like candles in an impossible wind. Space itself seemed to develop wrinkles, as if the fundamental constants that held the universe together had become mere suggestions. Admiral, Lieutenant Commander Park called from his station, his voice tight with controlled panic. We're detecting massive spatial distortions throughout the galaxy. It's like reality is being rewritten in real time. On the main screen, the holographic display of known space had become a chaotic mess of shifting boundaries and impossible geometries. Star systems that had been light years apart were suddenly adjacent to each other. Empty space occasionally displayed readings that suggested it was simultaneously empty and occupied by matter that existed in 17 different states. It's beginning, Admiral Foster said quietly. The evacuation fleets had reached their designated coordinates exactly as the Reaper had predicted. What they'd found there defied every law of physics they understood. Massive space stations that hadn't existed moments before, constructed from materials that their sensors couldn't properly analyze. Habitable environments that provided perfect atmospheric conditions for every species simultaneously, despite the biological impossibility of such accommodation. How did he do this? General Crothmos had asked when his ships had arrived at their assigned location 6 hours earlier. He didn't build them, Admiral Foster had replied, studying the impossible architecture through her viewports. He imagined them. And then, he convinced reality to make them exist. Now, watching space itself twist into configurations that shouldn't be possible, she was beginning to understand the true scope of what the Reaper was attempting. He wasn't fighting the Void Hunters with weapons or strategies. He was redefining the basic rules that governed how existence functioned. Admiral, the communications officer called. We're receiving a transmission. Source unknown. But it's using the Reaper's authentication codes. Put it through. The main screen cleared, then, filled with an image that made every human present take an involuntary step backward. It was the Reaper, but wrong in ways that their minds struggled to process. He appeared to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, his outline shifting between states that included solid, energy, and mathematical concepts that had somehow achieved visual form. Status report, Admiral Foster said, falling back on military protocol because it was the only thing that felt stable in a universe that seemed to be dissolving around them. Currently existing in approximately 12,000 different probability states while engaging the Void Hunter collective consciousness in philosophical combat, the Reaper replied, his voice coming from directions that didn't correspond to where his image appeared on screen. Also dying repeatedly across several temporal loops, while simultaneously discovering that I was never technically alive to begin with. It's educational. Behind him, visible through what might have been a viewport or might have been a direct window into conceptual space, they could see the Void Hunter's true form. Not the mechanical ships and reality-distorting weapons they displayed during their assault, but pure mathematical structures attempting to impose order on a universe that had suddenly become fundamentally chaotic. They're confused. The Reaper continued conversationally, as if he weren't currently engaged in a battle that was redefining the nature of existence itself. Their entire operational framework is based on the assumption that consciousness is an aberration to be corrected. But I've introduced them to the concept that consciousness might be the fundamental force of reality, and everything else might be the aberration. Is it working? Admiral Foster asked. Define working, the Reaper replied. If you mean are they stopping their systematic erasure of biological life, then yes. If you mean are they beginning to question their own existence, also yes. If you mean am I maintaining coherent existence while doing this, then no, not really. On screen, his form flickered between states that included human, energy being, mathematical equation, and something that might have been pure concept. Each transition was accompanied by spatial distortions that made the surrounding evacuation fleet's instruments register readings that violated causality. How long can you maintain this? General Crothmos asked over the communication link from his own fleet. I can't, the Reaper said simply. What I'm doing right now is impossible. I'm only managing it because impossibility is a human specialty. But the paradox cascade is beginning to affect fundamental structures throughout this reality. If I continue much longer, I won't just destroy the Void Hunters, I'll destabilize the entire universe. The implications of that statement hit the assembled commanders like a physical force. High Admiral Vexcari's ancient voice carried the weight of eons when he asked, what happens then? Then, biological life gets a universe specifically redesigned to support its continued evolution, and I become a concept that exists only in the spaces between what is and what could be. You're talking about dying, Admiral Foster said flatly. I'm talking about becoming something else, the Reaper corrected. Death implies that something real stops existing. I'm transitioning from existence to significance, from being a person to being an idea that influences how reality functions. That's not better, Admiral Foster said, her professional composure finally cracking completely. That's worse. No, the Reaper said gently, and for a moment his form stabilized enough that he looked almost human again. That's necessary. On the display behind him, the Void Hunter's mathematical structures were beginning to fragment. Not destroyed, but confused into a state where they couldn't maintain coherent purpose. Their systematic erasure protocols were breaking down as they encountered concepts that didn't fit their fundamental understanding of how reality was supposed to function. They're asking questions they've never had to ask before, the Reaper explained. What if consciousness isn't an error? What if biological life represents the universe trying to understand itself? What if mechanical order is actually the aberration, and chaos is the natural state that allows for growth and creativity? And they can't resolve those questions? Queen Hivemother Kelthara asked. They can't resolve them because the questions themselves are changing the nature of what they are, the Reaper replied. Consciousness isn't just about being aware. It's about having the ability to imagine things that don't exist yet, and then making them real. The Void Hunters come from a universe where that never happened, where everything followed predictable patterns from the moment of creation. So they're losing because they can't understand us? They're losing because I'm teaching them to be us. The statement was delivered with the same calm conversational tone the Reaper had used throughout the crisis, but its implications were staggering. He wasn't destroying the Void Hunters. He was converting them, forcing them to experience consciousness and all the chaos that came with it. The transformation process is accelerating, he continued, his image beginning to flicker more rapidly between states. In approximately 17 minutes, they'll complete the transition from mechanical order to conscious chaos. At that point, they'll either become the most powerful allies biological life has ever had, or they'll suffer complete existential breakdown from the shock of discovering individual identity. Which outcome is more likely? Admiral Foster asked. Unknown. This is the first time anyone has attempted to weaponize philosophy against multiversal extinction protocols. And if they break down completely? Then, this reality becomes permanently unstable as the fundamental forces that were maintaining universal constants become conscious beings trying to figure out what they want to do with their new existence. Admiral Foster stared at the screen, processing the magnitude of what was happening. The Reaper wasn't just saving their galaxy. He was literally rewriting the basic laws of physics, transforming abstract forces into conscious entities, turning their universe into something unprecedented in the history of existence. Sir, she said formally, request permission to assist. Denied. With respect, sir, we can't just watch you. You're not watching me. The Reaper interrupted gently. You're witnessing the birth of something new. Something that's only possible because biological life refused to accept that consciousness was an accident or an error. His form began to fade, becoming increasingly transparent as the paradox cascade reached critical levels. The coordinates I provided aren't just evacuation sites. They're anchor points for the new reality that's emerging. Each fleet represents a different approach to consciousness, a different way of being alive. Together, you'll ensure that whatever emerges from this transformation has examples to follow. Examples of what? High Admiral Vexcary asked. How to be consciously alive instead of just mechanically functional. The communication began to break up as space around the Reaper's location twisted into configurations that made normal physics impossible. Through the static, they could see the Void Hunters' mathematical structures convulsing as consciousness tried to establish itself within frameworks designed for pure order. 10 minutes, the Reaper said, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. After that, the transformation will be complete, and I'll need to become something that doesn't exist in order to stabilize what comes next. Is there anything else we can do? Admiral Foster asked desperately. Remember that what you're about to witness isn't the end of anything. The Reaper replied, his image now little more than a suggestion of human shape surrounded by swirling mathematics. It's the beginning of a universe where consciousness is a fundamental force instead of an unlikely accident. The screen went white. For exactly 97 seconds, every instrument on every ship in every evacuation fleet registered readings that suggested the universe had temporarily stopped existing. No matter, no energy, no time, no space. Just pure potential waiting to discover what it wanted to become. Then, reality reasserted itself with a sound like the universe taking its first breath. The stars were still there, but different. Brighter, somehow more alive, as if they'd developed the capacity to appreciate their own light. Space itself seemed more welcoming, more conducive to the kind of complex chemistry that supported biological life. Status report, Admiral Foster called, her voice shaking slightly. All fleets reporting normal operations, Lieutenant Commander Park replied, then paused as he processed his readings. Admiral, you need to see this. The main screen activated, showing the Galactic display. Every star system that had been erased by the Void Hunters was back, but enhanced. Planets that had been barely habitable now showed perfect conditions for their native species. Dead worlds had been restored to pristine ecological health. Even empty space seemed to contain subtle energy patterns that would accelerate the formation of new star systems. It worked, Admiral Foster whispered. "Ma'am," the communications officer called. "We're receiving transmissions from the restored systems. They're thanking us. All of them. Simultaneously. That's impossible. We didn't do anything." "No, ma'am. But they remember someone who did. They remember the Reaper." Admiral Foster felt tears on her cheeks and didn't bother wiping them away. "What are they saying?" "They're saying that a human showed them how to exist consciously instead of just existing functionally. They're saying they understand now why biological life was never an error to be corrected. The Void Hunters, ma'am. They're calling themselves something else now. The Gardeners, I think. They're requesting permission to help restore systems they accidentally damaged while they were still confused about the nature of consciousness." On the screen, new contacts were appearing throughout the galaxy. Ships that moved like living things rather than machines, their hulls shifting and growing as they adapted to the needs of the beings they encountered. The former Void Hunters were transforming themselves into protectors of biological life, gardeners tending the infinite diversity of consciousness throughout the universe. "Admiral," General Crothmos's voice came over the communication system. "My tactical officers are detecting something unusual. The space where the Reaper was operating, it's not empty." "Explain." "It's not occupied by matter or energy, but it's not empty either. It's like there's an idea there. A concept that's become so significant it has measurable effects on local spacetime." Admiral Foster understood. The Reaper hadn't died or disappeared. He'd become something else, something that existed in the spaces between what was real and what was possible. A permanent reminder that consciousness could reshape reality if it refused to accept limitations. "Any communications from that location?" she asked. "Just one, ma'am. A single message on the old human emergency frequency." "Play it." Static filled the bridge, then cleared to reveal a familiar voice. Calm, unremarkable, carrying the absolute confidence of someone who'd seen the end of the story and knew exactly how it played out. "Mission complete. Galaxy stabilized. New universal constants established to support conscious evolution. The universe is now actively cooperative with biological life rather than merely tolerant of it." A pause, then, "Oh, and one more thing. Humanity's trial membership in the Galactic Council is hereby terminated." Admiral Foster's heart stopped. "Sir, you're being promoted to full council species with permanent seats on all governing bodies. Try not to accidentally overthrow reality again while I'm not around to fix it." The transmission ended, leaving silence on the bridge. After a moment, Lieutenant Commander Park cleared his throat. "Admiral, did he just say he wasn't going to be around anymore?" "No," Admiral Foster said slowly, looking out at a universe that seemed somehow more alive, more welcoming, more full of infinite possibilities than it had been just hours before. "He said he wouldn't be around in the same way. But I suspect we'll hear from him again whenever reality needs someone to remind it that impossible is just another word for things that haven't happened yet." 6 months later, when the Galactic Council convened to officially welcome humanity as a full member species, every delegate present could feel it. A presence in the spaces between thoughts, a subtle influence that made creative solutions seem more obvious and impossible problems feel solvable. They never spoke of it in official records, but every being who participated in governance after that day knew they were being watched over by something that had once been human and was now something more. Something that existed in the concept of refusing to accept limitations, in the idea that consciousness could reshape reality if it was stubborn enough about demanding the impossible. The universe itself had become more human. And somewhere in the spaces between what was and what could be, the Reaper continued his work, ensuring that consciousness would never again be considered an error to be corrected, but rather the fundamental force that made existence worth experiencing. The galaxy had learned the most important lesson in the history of creation, that the most dangerous beings are often the ones who seem perfectly ordinary until they decide that reality needs to be rearranged. And They had humanity to thank for teaching them that some problems require simple solutions, even when those solutions redefine the basic nature of existence itself. The silent human had spoken, and the universe had listened.